On the night of December 14, 2025, Los Angeles didn't just lose a director. The city lost something Rob Reiner had made people believe in through his movies. He made people believe that humans can still be kind to each other, and that they can still talk things out even when they don't agree. But the very man who told those warm, caring stories, along with his wife Michelle Singer Reiner, was found dead inside their own home, with both of their bodies showing many stab wounds. It was such a horrible and shocking scene that people all over the world didn't even know how to feel. The news traveled fast, and everyone went quiet, not because they didn't care, but because the sadness was too big and too strange to put into words. Rob Reiner was the filmmaker who made America believe that friendship was real and powerful through Stand By Me. He made people believe that fairy tales could actually be smart through The Princess Bride. He made people believe that love between grown-ups is something you have to work at and talk through with respect through When Harry Met Sally. And he made people believe that doing the right thing can stand up to people in charge through A Few Good Men. He could move from funny movies to really serious ones and still tell stories in a way that felt human and real, never fake, never preachy, and never trying too hard to teach a lesson. The 1980s and 1990s took him all the way to the top, but being at the top doesn't mean you're safe. Behind all that success was the heavy price of living a life where everyone is always watching you, of having a huge amount of talent, of being in the public eye where people argue about everything you do, of having a legacy that was both beautiful and complicated, and of a life that was finally cut short in the most violent way possible. So what quietly shaped Rob Reiner from the very beginning, before he became the person who told Hollywood's kindest stories, and before everything ended on a night no one was ready for? That violent ending makes us want to go back in time and look at all the different things that slowly made Rob Reiner who he was, long before he became a powerful director, and even before his name was connected to some of Hollywood's most gentle and beloved films. It all started not with sadness or struggle, but in a home where laughter and serious conversation always lived side by side, where telling stories wasn't just a job, it was just part of everyday life. Rob Reiner was born in 1947 in the Bronx, New York, into a family where art was everywhere, just like the air you breathe. His dad, Carl Reiner, was one of the big creative minds that helped shape American television after World War II. Carl was a man who spent most of his life in writers' rooms, on experimental stages, and in long conversations about how one line of dialogue could make an audience laugh and also make them stop and think. So Rob's childhood wasn't about fame or red carpets. It was about behind-the-scenes rhythms, the discipline of the craft, a quiet kind of seriousness, and the idea that comedy wasn't just about getting laughs, it was actually a smart way to say hard things in a form people were actually willing to hear. But outside of his family, Rob Reiner quickly figured out that he didn't fit in easily anywhere. At school, kids saw him as the showbiz kid. He was different enough that people kept their distance, but not outstanding enough to be the center of attention. He wasn't an athlete. He wasn't a natural-born leader. He got used to standing on the edges of things, watching how people treated each other, noticing how power and attention worked in small social spaces. That feeling of being on the outside wasn't dramatic or painful in an obvious way, but it stuck around. Slowly, it turned into a personal habit of standing back to observe and understand rather than rushing in to be noticed. Inside his own family, that habit got pulled in a whole different direction. Carl Reiner was a loving dad, but he was also a huge intellectual presence, someone celebrated in public and at home. He cast a big shadow that was really hard to step out from. His constant busyness left Rob growing up with two feelings at the same time, deep admiration and quiet caution. If Rob followed art, people would compare him to his dad. If he chose a different path, it would feel like he was running away from his father's legacy. That tension never blew up into big fights, but it settled into an early decision. If he was going to tell stories, he was going to tell them differently from his father. Less pure comedy, more real conversation. Less laughing at situations, more focus on people, on right and wrong, and on the choices people make. Growing up in New York in the 1950s and 1960s, when America kept bumping into big generational arguments and social changes, Rob Reiner was never disconnected from what was going on around him. His later decision to study film at UCLA wasn't just a career move. It was a way to find a language that could handle all the contradictions he had been carrying since he was a kid, between being funny and being serious, between believing in the goodness of people and accepting how complicated real life actually is. In his early years working in television, going from small acting roles to writing jobs, he slowly learned that for a story to really matter, the person telling it has to be okay with tension, friction, and disagreement. And for Rob Reiner, none of those things had ever been unfamiliar. He didn't get into the business through one big break. He got in through scattered small appearances, just enough to learn how to stand in front of a camera, but not enough for anyone to remember his name. Reiner showed up in The Andy Griffith Show, Batman, and The Beverly Hillbillies, tiny roles that came and went, pushing him to adapt to fast-paced sets and the humble position of a young actor with no special privileges. There he learned restraint. He learned how to listen to the way other people delivered their lines. He learned how to exist inside a scene without trying to take it over, a skill that matched perfectly with the observer instinct he had developed since childhood. His entry into film was just as slow and careful. Enter Laughing in 1967, his film debut directed by his own father, opened a door but also put him in an awkward spot, offering an opportunity while making sure everyone was comparing him to Carl Reiner. Halls of Anger in 1969 followed, heavier in theme, showing that Reiner could hold his own in tense dramatic moments, but still not enough to create a voice of his own. He floated between supporting actor and a face still looking for its own identity, between being invited because of his ability and being doubted because of whose son he was. Alongside acting, Reiner slowly leaned toward written comedy, where the pressure was different, quieter, but just as tough. Joining the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, he walked into a creative environment full of debate where comedy and politics were completely tangled up with each other. The writer's room became a second school. Every joke had to survive censorship. Every idea got tested through direct confrontation. At that in-between point, somewhere between an unknown actor and an unformed comedy writer, Reiner was being pulled in several directions at once, learning to perform in front of people while also sharpening his ability to ask hard questions through humor. From all of that tension, he built up a crucial kind of experience, an understanding of television's rhythm, the weight of a well-written line, and the price you pay when a story dares to touch something sensitive. All of it quietly got him ready for the next big explosion in his life, the moment that would push Rob Reiner from the edge of the frame into the center of a national conversation. That in-between state ended in 1971, when Rob Reiner stepped into what looked like an ordinary television apartment but would turn out to be one of the biggest cultural battlegrounds in American history. All in the Family premiered without much fanfare, and in its early episodes it even made people uncomfortable because its tone was too blunt and too honest for the cozy and familiar sitcom format. Reiner played Michael, nicknamed Meathead, Stivic, the young and progressive son-in-law who constantly butted heads with Archie Bunker, a character who represented old-fashioned, conservative, prejudiced America. The role gave Reiner nowhere to hide. From the very first episodes, he was thrown right into the middle of clashes between old and young generations, between ugly language that had long been swept under the rug and the habit of denying that any of it was a problem, between laughter and the uncomfortable feeling that stuck around long after the episode was over. Michael wasn't a perfect hero. He argued constantly, sometimes too rigid in his beliefs, sometimes too naive. But he consistently represented a whole generation of young people trying to name the problems that American television had always avoided: racism, homosexuality, abortion, the Vietnam War, and the changing roles of women. Audience reaction at first was all over the place. Ratings were just okay. The network pushed back hard, but over time it was exactly that discomfort that kept people watching. All in the Family climbed to the top of the ratings and stayed there for years, becoming the most defining television show of the entire 1970s, winning tons of nominations and major awards, and permanently connecting the image of Michael Meathead to Rob Reiner. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere on set was just as tense as what viewers saw on screen. Reiner and Carol O'Connor, who played Archie Bunker, didn't clash personally, but they bumped into each other professionally on a regular basis. O'Connor came from a classical acting tradition and cared deeply about comic timing and tonal control. Reiner, younger and sharper, kept pushing back on how seriously the show should treat the social issues it was bringing to screen. He challenged scripts and suggested changes so that Michael would better reflect the real energy of student activism, social movements, and the urgency of that era. Script readings were rarely calm. Norman Lear, the creator of the show, didn't try to shut this down. He actually encouraged the debate, treating the tension between cast members as creative fuel, believing that the disagreement was exactly what made the relationship between Archie and Michael feel so electric that audiences couldn't look away. Season after season, Reiner reached a level of television success that very few young actors ever get to touch. But he also became sharply aware of his own limits. The Meathead role was becoming a cage. The same arguments in different situations, over and over, made him realize he was saying the same things in different settings without growing. After the 8th season, Reiner chose to walk away from the show, turning down spin-offs even though the success was still very much there. Michael was written out of the story, and for Reiner it marked the end of a chapter that had been both triumphant and exhausting, and the beginning of a much more dangerous gamble, walking away from the peak of television to step into directing, where no one would argue on his behalf and every decision would have to be made and defended on his own. The decision to leave All in the Family came with zero guarantees beyond the fame he already had. And that was exactly what made Rob Reiner's next move so risky. Hollywood looked at him the way it always looks at sitcom actors who want to go bigger, with skepticism, caution, and a quiet readiness to say, "Told you so," if things fell apart. A performer walking away from a hit television role and announcing he wanted to work behind the camera meant accepting the real possibility of losing everything if the leap didn't work. Reiner understood this very clearly. He chose to build his own path by co-founding Castle Rock Entertainment, not to show off his power, but to hold on to creative control, the very thing he had spent years fighting for since his days at the script table. The first step on that road was anything but safe. In 1984, This Is Spinal Tap came out, and it was a genuine professional bet. Made as a mockumentary with no fixed script, the film ran entirely on improvisation in every single scene, an approach that Hollywood simply wasn't used to at the time. That kind of freedom kept the whole production in a constant state of uncertainty. Nobody on set knew if they were making a comedy film, an extended joke, or a documentation of their own careers falling apart. When it was released, the film flopped at the box office and made almost no commercial impact. A lot of viewers even thought it was a real documentary about an actual fading rock band. But that very misunderstanding quietly cracked open another door. Spinal Tap didn't disappear with its weak box office numbers. Instead, it spread slowly through home video, through music circles, through audiences who gradually realized they were watching a completely new kind of comedy, one where the line between truth and fiction completely dissolved, and where improvisation itself became a storytelling language. Over time, the film became a cult classic, recognized as a foundational work that deeply shaped the entire mockumentary genre across both film and television. What had once looked like Rob Reiner's early stumble eventually became the very first artistic foundation of his directing career. After the prickly experiment of This Is Spinal Tap, Reiner had to prove he could do more than break the rules. He had to prove he could tell stories that audiences could actually step into and feel comfortable in. The Sure Thing in 1985 was born from that need. Quiet, unpretentious, and carefully chosen, it was a romantic comedy aimed at younger audiences that followed a more traditional structure with a tighter rhythm and placed its focus on dialogue and on small but genuine collisions between two strangers. Reiner didn't try to show off after Spinal Tap. He stepped back, observed, adjusted, and demonstrated that he could control tone, the very quality Hollywood had doubted in directors who came from television. The Sure Thing wasn't a big explosion, but it confirmed that Reiner could stand comfortably inside mainstream cinema without losing who he was as a storyteller. From that foundation, Stand By Me in 1986 arrived not as another test but as a full emotional bet. Adapted from a short story by Stephen King, the film deliberately avoided the horror and shock elements King was famous for and instead focused on what seemed like a small journey, for boys going to find the body of another kid. But what Reiner was really after wasn't the body. It was that final moment of childhood when friendships start to crack, when fear is no longer about monsters but about the irreversible reality of. He let the camera move slowly, gave memory time to breathe, let silences and looks take the place of big dramatic climaxes. There was no manipulative soundtrack pushing emotions, no labeled lesson, only the delicate feeling of a summer that everyone once had and then lost forever. When the film came out, its box office performance was better than anyone expected. But the more important response came from audiences who didn't see Stand By Me as just a teen movie, but as a mirror of their own memories. The film quickly moved beyond box office categories to become an emotional landmark, one that people kept returning to, quoting, and carrying with them across generations. With Stand By Me, Rob Reiner did more than just prove he could work in multiple genres. He showed that he could reach the deepest parts of human memory through restraint, careful attention, and a quiet faith in human nature, a faith that his films would keep chasing whether in comedy, romance, or drama. From Stand By Me, Rob Reiner didn't settle into a safer, more comfortable phase. He entered a series of deliberately opposite choices where each new film seemed to push back against the one before it. The Princess Bride in 1987 came out of that spirit, a fairy tale blended together with adventure, humor, romance, and self-parody all at once, difficult to put into a category and difficult to market. Its box office performance was modest, not a disaster, but nowhere close to a major hit. What followed, however, took a completely different path. The film lived on in people's imaginations, quoted and parodied and passed from one generation to the next as a cultural language all its own. Reiner didn't force The Princess Bride to be important. He let it exist with a rare kind of innocence. And it was exactly that lack of calculation that slowly turned the film into a legacy, a shared memory that Hollywood has been struggling to recreate ever since. 2 years later he took a sharp turn. When Harry Met Sally in 1989 left behind fairy tales and childhood nostalgia to face a thornier question about adult love. Can men and women actually be genuine friends without eventually crossing a line? Reiner went at the romantic comedy with almost surgical precision. Sharp dialogue, tightly controlled pacing, emotions that built up slowly over time rather than exploding all at once on cue. The film became a massive commercial success and at the same time completely redefined the modern romantic comedy genre. The production wasn't entirely smooth though. The now famous fake orgasm scene almost didn't make it into the final cut because of fears about how audiences would react. Keeping it wasn't about shock value. It was about preserving the raw and honest truth of an experience that was both hilarious and quietly revealing about deep loneliness. Choices like that one made sure When Harry Met Sally didn't get stuck in its era but instead kept being brought up as a benchmark for the genre.